Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today to hear more about behavioral aspects of sustainability. Before we delve into that topic, I just wanted to remind you to stay tuned and follow news on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages, Warwick Behavioural Insights Team. We have the next event already lined up. If you want to learn more about behavioral consulting, check it out. It will be a fascinating talk delivered by Corey Consulting. And now, without further ado, please welcome Colin Strong from Ipsos, who is going to explain to us why sometimes it is so difficult to do as we say, and how we can try to improve that. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me here. Good to be here and talking to you in these changed circumstances. So I lead behavioural science at Ipsos, and the whole issue of what we say and what we do is a theme which is often debated, and our clients want to understand and just try to sort of explore and try to sort of resolve in many different contexts. But pro-social behaviours is one, and sustainability is one area where this apparent say-do gap is particularly important, and that's what we'll just talk about today. But in a way, you know, this provides us with a useful platform to talk about many of the issues which we face in applied behavioural science generally. So I thought it would be useful to be able to perhaps share some wider thoughts. But let's dive in. We're Ipsos. We're a global market research organisation, consumer insights across 80 different markets. So we have lots of activity and lots of polling which we do. The good news is I've got quite a lot of numbers which I can share with you, which are in the public domain, and a lot around sustainability. And this is an area we do lots of research in. And it doesn't take me to tell you that there's a desire for change, and a lot of people see this as very serious and very important, and feel a strong sense of responsibility, and consider this is really important for not just for us but also for future generations as well. So the consumers are definitely very, very aware and very conscious of these issues, and there's a lot of emotion around this. And perhaps hitting the headlines in the last week or so was Shell, who are really making strides to move into a very different kind of proposition than they have been historically, and moving into carbon reduction type of activities. And they put an innocent poll out on Twitter, and you may have seen this in the news or seen this on Twitter, and they were immediately really trolled by vast numbers of people with all sorts of responses which may seem fairly witty or aggressive, or maybe making perfectly reasonable points, and it depends upon your perspective. But the point is, in a way, you can see that we work for brands, we work for governments, we work for brands, and we need to understand these things and understand how people are exploring and making decisions around these sorts of areas. So you can see there's a lot of emotion going on in those tweets, and perhaps not unreasonably, people are alarmed. People recognise the need for action. When we ask people globally, do you think environmental issues pose a serious threat to your health? Huge numbers of people saying yes to that. It's a massive issue. And people saying, yeah, look, the government should make environmental protection a priority in recovery from COVID. So it really feels as if the public is very much on side in the vast majority of the public, in terms of environment and sustainability issues. And maybe this is the point where it then starts to sort of move to us as psychologists, behavioural scientists, so that when people are asked, do you think you have a responsibility to ensure that your generation does not destroy the planet? Large numbers of people are agreeing, yes, we do. Yes, I have a responsibility to do that. And so therefore, clearly that people are thinking, well, that I need to do something about my behaviour. Now, alongside this, so in an anticipation of this, brands are making significant investments. So P&G, for example, with their fabric care brands, do lots of work in terms of creating compacted versions of the products. And if with compaction, what that means is that then you've got sort of less materials being used for things like packaging. It's easier to transport because it's lighter, and so you've got a whole sort of virtuous set of things there going on for the consumer. So buy perhaps more concentrated or compacted products, as they're called, as a one way of reducing your environmental impact. Unilever in 2013 launched deodorants in reduced cans, and claiming they could get the same amount of product in the new reduced size. Now, these are all really good initiatives and sort of solid kind of things for brands to be doing. But the problem is, it's quite hard to evaluate the impact of these kind of things. But I think that the general sense is that the consumer response to these is not as positive as brands would necessarily like. And I don't think that these deodorants are now available in the marketplace. And perhaps we can draw our own conclusions from that in terms of the degree to which they were getting consumer traction. Similarly, an interesting one is with Nespresso, and they have made a massive investment in order to facilitate recycling. They've invested over 185 million Swiss francs in their recycling programs. So the pods which you get with Nespresso, then you can, it's in order to facilitate that recycling, and they've got a whole ecosystem around it. You can get a free recycling bag. You can get it free. They will even send somebody to your door to collect your recycling pods. So it's pretty impressive, but they've reached a global recycling rate of 30%. So why is that? It's just like, so all these sorts of measures which get put into place, you can see all the desire for people and the importance for the environment. So why aren't we delivering on some of these sorts of things? And similarly, there's a point here, and there's some polling which we've done at Ipsos, looking over time, looking at asking people about the things they might do in order to limit their own contribution. How likely or unlikely would you be to do the following changes within the next year? There isn't really a huge amount of difference between them. There's a little bit of an uplift, but perhaps a little bit of an uplift on walking and cycling instead of using a car. Perhaps that might have changed now, saving energy. But some areas are pretty low. So we're not necessarily seeing significant change in some of these behaviours. So we have a bit of a puzzle about what we do with this, and how do we go about addressing this particular conundrum. So there are a few kind of possibilities which we may have, and one of the possibilities which is often mentioned in this context is the notion that, well, maybe people don't really kind of know what they're not either able to say what they really think because they don't. We'll come on to that, or maybe they're just a bit too embarrassed to tell us what they really think. So maybe there's a whole social desirability thing going on there, in that people aren't really able to able to sort of fess up that actually they don't really care, and they're just going to carry on as normal, but they'll tell the interviewer that they're hoping to do all these sorts of good things, that they care about it. So you can have a read of this book, which is takes that particular angle through things, although I would say I'm not entirely convinced by the narrative in this book, as will perhaps become clear over the course of this talk. Also, the other thing is that perhaps as you're non-conscious, perhaps you've got a kind of perhaps your the narrative which does the rounds often, which is that what you say is one thing, but actually this is just a mere kind of smokescreen for what's really going on, and that you don't really have much access to what's really going on, or to the way in which you can shape your behaviour, and it's just these are sort of hidden from your depths, and there's no way you can possibly say what it is that you're going to be doing. So that's another sort of possible explanation for this behaviour which we're seeing. Or maybe, another one which is popular is that do our evolutionary instincts mean that we're hopelessly selfish? And actually, and this is an extension of the previous point, is that, well, maybe we're just sort of born to be selfish and driven by pure self-interest, and there is no such thing as sort of pro-social behaviour or intentions, and these are just ways for us to gain some benefits somehow, and leverage some benefit. So there's all sorts of reasons which fly around, which are possibilities for how we might perhaps not necessarily always do what it seems we're worried about, and that doesn't necessarily always translate into action. Anna, I meant to mention at the start is that I can pause at various points in case there's sort of comments or questions, but I will continue to just talk. But if there is anything when we get to a kind of key point, then do shout, because and people do feel free to pop something in the chat, a question or a comment or a challenge, and we can either get to them as we go along, or we can deal with them at the end. I don't really mind. So but maybe we could find a way of just stepping back slightly, because I think it's useful to have a little bit of a meta view of humans and human behaviour, because I think one of the problems we have as psychologists is that we love getting into the detail, don't we? And there's a and sometimes it's a bit hard to see the bigger picture. And I think it's useful to perhaps think a little bit more carefully with some meta theories about, look, more broadly, how do we think humans behave? What are the kind of the big themes which sort of sit behind human behaviour? And I think some of the conversations that there have been recently with regard to COVID has really helped us to look at things a little bit more with a bit of a bigger picture view. And one of the people here I would really recommend reading is some of the things that Stephen Reicher has been talking about. And he's on SPI-B. He's at a university in Scotland. I can't remember which one. And he makes a few interesting points, and he was talking about some of the conversations which there's been around this sort of assumption that people who don't adhere to things, pro-social things, are sort of more psychologically unable or unwilling to cope with difficult environments, and and it's assumed that their goals are fairly negative. They're not necessarily concerned about other people, and to some of the points which we were talking about just now, and I think this is a view which was sort of being called sort of behavioural fatigue, famously over the course of the summer, and I'm sure you've talked about it in other contexts, but it's a view which has been hugely challenged by a wide range of behavioural scientists, including your very own Nick Chater, who's sort of come out quite strongly against this notion. But nevertheless, it is something which I think, informed more broadly the way in which we tend to think about humans, and perhaps this notion of behavioural fatigue is one particular way of expressing it. But nevertheless, it fits in my mind in a kind of broader sense of people perhaps not necessarily being motivated to do the right thing, The alternative here is that, as Reicher would talk about, is that, and he has talked about, is the way in which actually in points of disaster, as we see the way in which people are actually inclined to work together for the collective good. And we see this in disaster response, that people are resilient, they act in an orderly way, they support each other, and all the better if you've got a shared sense of identity, as people can come together in a collective way. Now, the point is, this has huge implications. This sort of simple kind of challenge has huge implications for what do you do about it. And I'm talking as a practitioner, and this is where where I come from, and say, well, look, what do you actually do? That's the point first and foremost. And if you're of the fragile mind's point of view, then I'd say that you do go have a kind of paternalistic nudge type of activity, and you have sanctions for non-adherence, because you're of the school that people, well, they either don't know, or they they don't care enough, or they're not able to deliver on things because the way they process information. So they need to be sort of nudged in the right direction, or worse, they don't want to do it, in which case you've got to put sanctions on them. The pro-social view would be that actually it's all about how do you facilitate this good behaviour? How do you overcome the barriers? Because actually, from that perspective, then what people are on the whole trying to do the right thing, but just not able to deliver on it. And I think we could perhaps, this goes off at a little angle, we don't need to dwell on this, but there's a bit of a we could talk about some of the issues around nudge and the sort of debatable degree of impact, the kind of unintended consequences, and also the impact of sanctions for non-adherence. You alienate the population, and people will do the bare minimum for the demands which have been placed on them, rather than the sort of doing it because they want to, and therefore doing it more holistically and addressing a wider range of things in their lives. So the problem with the first view of people perhaps just being fragile-minded and either not willing or not able to address these things, the problem with this is that the solutions which come with it aren't necessarily particularly great, as far as I can see anyway. And I think, again, polling data, and this is where it does suggest that many people do, as we've seen, do have pro-social sustainability intentions. When you ask people about, what would they consider doing to limit their contribution to climate change, there's huge, large swathes of the population are saying, yeah, I'm pretty certain or pretty likely to be doing this stuff. Of course, not everybody, but a lot of people are. And I think I think this is where it's useful to perhaps to kind of use survey data to help you understand, well, look, we as psychologists, we talk about some of these sorts of theories and so on, but how do they play out more generally in the kind of things which people are talking about? How can we interpret some of this stuff? And I think there is a big body of evidence to suggest that people are fundamentally pro-social in nature, and as I say, and as Reicher points out, the degree of compliance adherence to safety measures during COVID has been phenomenal, despite the media reporting, which sort of obviously focuses on the kind of on where it goes wrong, but actually overall our polling suggests it's pretty high. So you can see the way in which actually people are minded to work together and to sort of work towards positive social goals. So in my mind, the evidence points us towards the need for us to facilitate behaviour. So I'll side with Raisha here in terms of saying, look, actually, the solution is not to provide punitive measures, or necessarily even to try to nudge people, focus on nudging people sort of non-consciously. Maybe we just need to think through about, it's not an issue of motivation. It's not an issue of people not being willing to engage. Perhaps it's an issue that actually there's a bunch of really good reasons why people are not engaging, and we can see that with COVID. You know, why are you not adhering to social distancing? Oh, well, maybe you have to go to work and mix with people where you don't have if you don't unless you're doing that, you're not going to get paid. Or maybe why are you going out when you've got symptoms? Well, again, maybe you're not going to get paid if you don't go out, etc. You know, or maybe you've got caring duties and it's problematic. So there's a bunch of sort of fairly good, I think Raisha makes the case there's a bunch of fairly good kind of environmental issues, but there's a whole wide range of things that's worth us looking at. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, because we're getting to it can be a bit of a shopping list of look, what are sorts of barriers, but let's have a few of them. One of them is actually maybe people don't see it as their responsibility. You know, this is not an unreasonable position to take. There's a huge sort of bunch of pieces of documentary work and so on, which suggests that actually for something which is fundamentally an industry issue has been psychologized, has been put onto the individual rather than the industry properly addressing it. And that's been a claim which is made time and again, and you can argue the rights and wrongs of that, but actually let's put that to one side. Look at how consumers think about it, and they a lot of the time will say, yeah, it's not really necessarily just my responsibility. A lot of this has to sit with government, or a lot of this has to sit with the with the industries which are creating this stuff. So you can see that it's not here we go, number one, it's like we need to think through, perhaps there's a barrier. The consumer doesn't necessarily think it's their responsibility, which is pretty important. Number two, well, it's pretty hard to work out sometimes, isn't it? Look at all the different logos you've got. Look at trying to sort of work out the kind of supply chains on stuff. There's a whole, do you buy a cucumber without plastic, but then knowing that actually the cucumbers are more likely to go off, even though and so therefore create greater waste. There's all sorts of complexities around these sorts of things, and the degree to which you perhaps doing something that's better for you versus better for the planet and so on. Consumers need help here. It's not necessarily a straightforward thing to navigate. People may not be able to afford it, and so this is an example of some little sort of experimental piece which we did at Ipsos, where we made up a brand which is a sustainable brand of washing up liquid, and we just looked at what people were doing and did it in an experimental setting, and we could just sort of observe the way in which people would be interested in this, but then looked at the price difference and thought, want to put it back, and went for the cheaper one. Now, it's not necessarily just that they can't afford it, but maybe there's a whole bunch of norms around what you pay for a washing up liquid, which we need to think about. Cultural values. Here we go. Here's another one. May not, the issues of what we're doing of some of these things, they may not necessarily easily align with our values, and we don't sit in isolation, as we all know, and maybe there's a whole bunch of cultural values which mean that actually, yeah, you kind of see this and it's kind of important, but it becomes a value-laden conversation which seems to be aligned with certain identities and political persuasions, and so you get things very much muddled up with that, which is another source of barrier. there's only so many things which you can prioritize is another key issue. We've all got a lot going on in our lives. It's and where does climate change sit relative to a whole bunch of other more immediate things which you might have going on in your life? And again, polling helps us to understand some of these sorts of things, and we can see the degree to which, for a lot of people, it's would disagree that it's a low priority, but for a lot of people, this may be really important, but right now, I've got my children's education, I've got my job to worry about, I've got my family, and so on and so forth. There's lots of very more immediate concerns which people have in their lives. And then finally, I just wanted to get to this point in this section. I just wanted to get to the point whereby I think it's kind of easy to ask questions in a way which result in a sort of misunderstanding of the way in which people are thinking about things. So it's very easy to ask a question about concern of the environment in a very kind of holistic way, say, so as we show there. But then to ask about the evidence for that concern in a very granular way, and to use a sort of traditional colloquial expression, you're kind of not really comparing like with like, it's apples and pears, really. You're asking something very high level, very broad, and then you're asking for evidence in it which is very granular, and any one of those things there can be all sorts of really good reasons as to why you might need a car, why you eat meat, whether or not you recycle every week. The problem is that and this is the kind of point which I'm making overall, I think, is that if you have a facilitating mindset around this sort of thing, it's actually that this is the very point. You expect there to be a say-do gap. There is going to be a say-do gap, and you need to understand why there's a say-do gap, and then find ways to actually unpick that and address it. And that's what I want to go on and talk about now. It's like, well, okay, as a practitioner, what do you actually do? So if I move on, so here's our vibe. So it's right. Let's fix this. What can we actually do? So I think this is the so I suppose this is where I think it's sort of useful to try and think this through and unpick some of this a little bit. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but I think it's useful to understand some of these differences between sort of academic work and practitioner work. I think first of all, I think as a practitioner, what you really need to do first off is understand the wide range of barriers that are in place. Because there's a bunch of different reasons why people don't do things, and actually market research is really good at helping to identify and articulate what those are. So a lot of the time we are users of survey work, qualitative work. We will look at all past research that's been done to just try and understand what's going on, what really is the problem. I tend to say that one of the issues in a way almost with applied work is almost knowing what the problems are is harder sometimes in teasing them out than actually delivering the answers. A proper, good, solid identification of the problem, the question which you're trying to answer, is often the most important point in any practitioner work, because it can be easy to assume you know what's going on, but maybe you're pointing yourself at completely the wrong problem. Then I think it's point which I've hopefully kind of been implying throughout this, and when we get to, is that you really need a holistic diagnosis of why that is what's going on. What are these barriers? How can you apply a psychology lens to better understand those sorts of barriers? And dig into it and convert it in a sense into your language and understanding of the world. And the important thing for this is that, look, we can't rely on one lens. And I think Sander van der Linden at I think it's at Cambridge has made some really good points around this, and some of the work which he's done. And what he's shown in his work is, look, the degree of variance which is explained by different sort of broad approaches, in and of themselves, they're kind of not enough. So if you look at a purely cognitive factors, which I've got a feeling many of you are probably drawn to if you're having a sort of behavioural science sort of perspective on life, it explains about 9.3% of the variance. If you look at the kind of people's sort of experiential processes, in terms of effect and personal experience, there's 22.08% of the variance. Good, better, but still not in and of itself, sort of not necessarily all that impressive. If you then got social cultural influences, and those can explain about 34%. You get the point. Any one area in and of itself ain't going to cut it. You really need to make sure that you have a holistic approach to doing that. So how do you do this? Because that's all very well, but what do you actually do? Because the problem is that we're awash with theories. There's a what do you do? There's hundreds, thousands of theories which you can draw on, and if you're looking to change behaviour, then Susan Mickey, as many of you be familiar with, produced this book, was saying, look, there's 83 theories of behaviour change, and actually that's not all of them either. There's plenty others, but we need theory because we need it, because they help us to identify what's going on. They mean that we can create more targeted interventions. We have to have theory, but the problem is there's so many of them, and and you're looking not only in terms of some of the sort of information cognitive processing type aspects, but maybe social cultural and so on, and some theories of emotion and so on and so forth. How do you manage all of that? And I think that's the really tricky issue as a practitioner. And I think this is why systems are so important in applied work, and really it's important, I think, and we're seeing this slowly happen, move from looking at individual theories of behaviour and their explanatory value to systems of behaviour which integrate theory. Now, and not only integrate theory, but as we'll come to, point to what you do about it, because understanding an issue, good, and then you can, and critical, but unless you've got some guidance as to what to do about it, it's kind of not, you're just left hanging, right? So it's so from a practitioner perspective, this is the critical stuff to get right. Again, there are plenty of systems, some better than others, and some more based on theory, some less based on theory, some, and the evaluation criteria from the Susan Mickey and colleagues at UCL is it's great. It's a great way of looking at it and understanding it and so on. And now we've our kind of point of reference on some of this stuff is the behaviour change wheel. And COM-B, and we like that. It's got it's comprehensive. It's as in deals with lots of sort of different kind of issues and questions, and you can use it more broadly. It's theory based, which we like, and we recognise the importance and the need for theory. There's a really clear link. There is a good link from understanding what the problem is through to intervention design. But one of the great things about it, it's got this huge body of knowledge sitting underneath it. It's a huge body of evidence about delivering sustained behaviour change. Things we don't like is a bit public health, which is fine for lots of things if you're working in public health, but not necessarily, is it really optimized for a bunch of other things like sustainability behaviors? The intervention guidance is a bit general. It's as a layperson, if you're a layperson working with this, good luck. It's going to be hard to navigate it. And it's pretty complex and hard to understand, which makes it hard to scale. And I'll talk a little bit about scaling in a minute. But don't want to dwell on this too much, but just to sort of say, look, that's why we have our own system, and really it's designed to be, used across a variety of different contexts. And one of the contexts we use it in is when we're talking about sustainability type behaviours. But that gives us a means to diagnose what's going on and to be able to say, well, look, where are the barriers? Are the barriers a kind of motivational type barrier? Are they a contextual barrier? Are they social and cultural social norms barrier? Are they a cultural values barrier? And I think, I'm not this works for us, but there's plenty of people use COM-B or other systems. And what they're able to do is you're able to then start to understand the kind of breadth of issues which are preventing that pro-social behaviour taking place. And you can look at it in a coherent, joined up manner, rather than having to pluck things from all these different places. And it really enables you to sort of narrow down and gives you a really good starting point for understanding. Now, that's not to say that's the end point, but it provides you with a really good kind of scoping out of what the issues are which are going on. Then the next point of this is really about this kind of so all very well. So you've done your diagnosis. You've got this kind of you've got a sort of more detailed understanding of what's going on, and with COM-B and with our framework and other frameworks, so typically have a next tier down. So you've got some fairly detailed understanding of what's going on. So what do you do about it? And then this is where often in applied settings, at least, and I think in academic settings as well, there isn't necessarily always a very coherent move from what I would call diagnosis through to design of interventions. It's kind of, there's some leaps of faith, and the problem with that is that everything can come crashing down into this chasm between the two, because you've done this really great work to understand what the issues are. You hand it all over to the marketing agency to then do something with it. Well, they don't. How do they? What should they be doing? And oftentimes the guidance isn't enough. We need something a little bit more clear and prescriptive to give to them. So that's where you really need to have clear mechanisms that link the diagnosis that you've got. And so I've got I don't know how kind of navigable these are, but there's on the top right up here, on the top left, sorry, you've got the kind of the diagnosis in a little bit more detail about some of the issues around, say, in here recycling. So you can understand you got the sort of the issues pulled into our way of understanding the world. And the beauty of that is that then that links through to, as you can see in the chart below, the box below, but let's not go through the detail of this. You can see the way in which there are design principles which are set out there to say, OK, if it is an identity issue, here's your design principles. If it is an emotion issue, here's your design principles. And we often use these sorts of card type systems to help sort of pull that through, to say, look, you've really got to have this kind of systems thinking approach right the way through, where you've got a coherent string going from here's your problem, the definition of the problem, to here's the diagnosis of it. Now let's design the what you actually do to overcome it, and then we can think about the mechanisms which you're going to be using in order to deliver on that. And I think that really flows back to a view of the human as needing help to enact their behaviour. It's that is sort of implied underneath this model of how to go about this managing and closing that say-do gap. It's not because people don't want to be doing the right thing. It's not because they're kind of actually self-interested. It's not because they kind of got this implicit thing going on which is causing them to do something entirely different. It is really because people need help, not just physically and environmentally, but also, psychologically as well. Maybe there's identity issues. Maybe they just don't see themselves as that kind of person. So how do you go about overcoming it? And so therefore, that then leads us through to some really straightforward, very clear sets of design principles which we're able to give out. Here's an example of one. It's not from sustainability, but it's something which is in the public domain which we had for a healthcare app. So we could then give some clear guidance around the kind of, look, here's the problem, right? Here's some ways in which you can go about correcting that problem. And then the final thing which I really wanted to talk about, and just very briefly touch on, because I think it's useful just to sort of be mindful of the way in which it's not necessarily purely about sort of how you think about it and what you do. It's also about how you bring along people with you on this journey, because part of the problem I think that we've got sometimes with behavioural science and applying behavioural science is that we are very dependent upon a small number of experts to deliver this stuff. And the problem with that is that that's all very well, but organizations are large, and you need people dotted around them who understand this and who are able to do that, and not just people in the kind of expert mold. You actually need people who are heading up teams, heading up sort of, I don't know, the recycling team, or who are just in who are delivering this stuff at the coalface, able to use the principles around this and apply the principles around this. And so this is why certainly within applied circles, this is kind of on the cusp of happening, and we're making it happen. It's that we need to move from a pure ad hoc model of behavioural science and behaviour change to one which is much more standardised. And experts don't really like this particular way of doing it, but this is what we need to be doing, and this is the direction of travel. And the expertise is codified. We got sort of governance by certification of people who are trained. We've got governance in terms of process and in terms of quality control. The point is that you're really democratizing and sort of giving wider access to people who are able to use this and able to facilitate these sorts of behaviour change activities. And this is the way we go about creating behaviour change. This is the way we go about sort of overcoming some of those barriers to sustainable practices. So that's. I'm just going to quickly summarise those points and then open up in case there's any comments or questions or challenges and so on. But I think hopefully I've kind of given you a reasonably coherent account, and it's wide ranging, but hopefully you kind of got the strand that runs through this, is that change will come from, I believe, fundamentally supporting pro-social behaviour. There is so much willingness and desire to deliver pro-social outcomes. It's a matter of that argument's been won on the whole, not right the way through, and there's kind of challenges, but it's a matter of facilitating those behaviours and getting people on side as you go through it. Now, what does that mean? The implications of that, because everything springs from that kind of meta theory that you've got of humans. And of course, there's different schools of thought, but I think that there's a good body of evidence to support that. But what that means is that we need holistic models of behaviour change to mitigate those barriers, not purely rely on sort of just a small number of interesting nudges. Yes, they have their place. There's part of the solution, but really we need to move on from just looking at processing, the way we process information. That's not enough. Behavioural science isn't just about information processing. There's a whole breadth of the discipline which we need to bring into our practice. Because as you saw from the Van der Linden paper, you know what, if you ignore that, then really you're ignoring so much of the variance, and that's just not an option. And then the third point, and it's a very pragmatic point, but it's a really important point, and I think it's one just to really bear in mind as we go through to, you know, trying to make change happen, is that change has to be put in the hands of people who can deliver it. That people need empowerment in order to understand that, and to be able to practice and deploy behaviour change principles. And it's really with those sorts of things in mind that we're then able to identify, understand and deliver on ways to close that gap between what you'd like to happen and what does actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions. So the first one is, how did you track the perceptions of people about the liquid?
How what, sorry?
How did you track the perceptions of people about the washing liquid?
Well, I don't think in terms of the was that just in terms of the tracking the mouse, or was it more generally? I think if you're looking at the sort of, so what we've got is it's an online store where we do experimental work looking at different kind of setups, and invite people to do different sorts of tasks. So we'll give them a wide range of different sorts of tasks, and we'll look at the outcomes of their behaviours. I think specifically on that one, there is a short. My colleagues who, not behavioural science colleagues, but some of my colleagues in the rest of the business have got a short paper, and I'm very happy to share that. So that's in the public domain. I think more generally, in terms of some of those sorts of things, it's you know, the degree to which some of those things have been successful or otherwise, it's hard to tell, you know, and there's all sorts of reasons why products come on the market or come off the market. But I think that I do think generally there's a sort of slight bafflement by brands who put, you know, millions into infrastructure to deliver on you know, lower carbon solutions, and because this is what people say they want, but then they're not buying them, and it's like, well, why? You know, what can we do? You know, we've made an investment here. You know, this isn't simple stuff. You got to invest millions in new production lines and you know, freighting and deals with supermarkets and so on and so forth. So, you know, these are huge sort of things which you need to navigate. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then the next question is, what do you think is more discouraging and contributing more to the say-do gap here? The fact that our actions are just a drop in the ocean of actions of others, or the fact that there is a seemingly longer time horizon to prioritize climate change than other problems in our lives?
I'm going to give a really boring answer and say it depends, because I think it kind of depends who you're talking to, and also, you know what, I don't really know. I think we talk about some of these things as outcome expectations. You know, it's just like what I do doesn't really make any difference, and so therefore what you need to do to then is to really find ways to be able to give people a sense that actually they are part of a body of people who it all matters. And so therefore you start thinking about, well, look, how do you then link that up to a sense of identity? For example, there's a really good campaign in I think it was in Texas, where there was an issue about littering, and they ran this great campaign saying, look, just trying to sort of demonstrate that a good Texan doesn't litter, and creating this sort of sense of identity around that. And I think that's part of the solution, in a sense, is that actually if you've got a strong social identity, then you don't see yourself so individually and so powerlessly anymore. And these are kind of quite radical thoughts in some ways, but these are the sorts of things which we need to think about, and we need to think radically about these sorts of things. So
a question from me: did the campaign from Texas worked? Do we have any data on that?
Yeah, we do. There's a paper from Moles I can share with you. I can't remember his first name, but it's a really great. Actually, it's a fabulous paper which really sort of challenges some of the notions around defaults, for example, and starts and perhaps norms, and starts talking about the way in which you can equally think about some of those things as identity type issues, and the importance perhaps of thinking about them in that way. And I think that flows through to, we can. Yeah, how do we interpret some of these things? What are the models of humans which we're going to then perhaps use as our guiding principles? And I think that's kind of what we need to understand a little bit, but often isn't necessarily always taught, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we will share the paper in the discussion
yes,
in the event later.
Sure.
The next question is, in the responsibility slide, France showed to have the highest percentage of consumer responsibility. Is this correlated with the extent to which the government is eco-friendly? For example, France is said to be the second most eco-friendly country. Accordingly, what is the consumer responsibility level for Switzerland, number one eco-friendly country? And what does this say about how fairness and responsibility drives decision making? Very, very long question.
Yeah, kind of like very long and very very difficult to answer. Yeah. I think I'm not sure. I mean, good. Thank you, Amy, and good, interesting question. My honest answer is I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. I think that I think if I've understood this correctly, is that people. So you're questioning that if people see themselves as responsible, then does that actually translate through into behaviour? And I think your point below is that what is the relationship between fairness and responsibility? And look, these are good questions which I don't necessarily have an answer, but yeah, absolutely, fairness it's a huge issue, isn't it? And what's fair, what's right is these all chime with some of the cultural values which we're also seeing as well. And I feel that we all of these are good questions, and I think that these all go into the mix, as it were, and this is why you kind of have to look at all of these things in the round and understand their interactions and understand their relative importance. So I don't have an answer for you here and now, but those are the kind of questions which, yeah, are perfectly legitimate to ask, and we need to understand. And then you've got a follow-up question about close the feedback loop on sustainable behaviours. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's a good point. It's perhaps sort of, it's hard to know, but do we always need a feedback loop is also my question. I mean, in a sense that I think that we perhaps Stephen Reicher might say that look, we lived through all sorts of disasters and difficulties, and we struggle for goals and purposes of fairness and just and justice. We don't necessarily see the fruits of our labours immediately, or often even in our lifetime. And I think there's a sort of I think this goes back a little bit to some of the models of humans and how we see humans. And do we see humans in a kind of econ kind of way, where it's all about outcomes, or do we think about humans in a broader way, where actually there's a broader set of considerations, and people will do what they consider to be the right thing to do, even if that's a considerable hardship to themselves, and even if they don't necessarily get to see the positive outcomes of that. And I think history and personal experience is littered with examples of that, and kind of that's what makes us human in some ways. So I'd say that in a way, you're never going to be able to close that gap properly, and you're never really going to be able to demonstrate the value of putting your banana skin into the recycling compost. It's just not, or even if you do, it's going to seem so minuscule. What's the point? So I think some of those kind of more econ models, what I would call them, are perhaps not really fit for purpose always for this kind of activity, those sorts of more pro-social, bigger, more challenging sorts of activities. I think they require a different model or a different way of thinking.
Thank you. There is one more question from our Facebook page. In your opinion, is the lack of adherence to COVID-related restrictions somehow related to people's risk tendencies, in addition to the behavioral fatigue?
I don't think there is that greater lack of adherence to these things, and I'm not. Look, I'd say that the way in which people evaluate their own risk is of course going to have something to do with this. But let's bear in mind that people are also have a. We were encouraged to eat out to help out. We were encouraged to go to the pub. We were encouraged to go back to the office. So there's lots of things whereby people have been encouraged to do things, and they duly did them. And yes, of course, you are going to get a small percentage of the population who are probably going to tip over into things which are problematic. But on the whole, I think that the big story here, but it's a boring story, so it doesn't really get reported, but this is the kind of story you get from polling, is that people are pretty compliant, pretty adherent to safety measures. So yes, I think you're probably right. There are some things around the edges, around the sort of the way in which we process information about risk. But on the whole, I think that we've kind of, we've got the we've got the memo, and we're responding appropriately to it. So I don't think that really answers your question, but we do actually have a paper on risk perception and some of the social cultural ways in which we form an evaluation of risk and beliefs about risk, but this is more specifically in relation to vaccination. But happy to share that, and that might be of interest looking at it from the COVID perspective.
Thank you very much. And then the next question. The 5p charge for plastic bags in the UK can be considered a great success. How does that fit within your framework, and what lessons can be learned that can be applied to address other sustainability issues?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a fair question. I'd say that the 5p charge, perhaps this is a point where perhaps what it's doing is creating a more salience around the issue, so that people can more clearly understand the significance of those individual usages, and it kind of creates a sort of wider set of beliefs and values. Now, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that it's a really effective nudge to kind of then make question you, do you actually want this bag? So I think rather than it being either or, I think it's both and, you know, it's a little bit of a nudge, but also it's a little bit of a kind of, it creates a kind of environment which is where there's a sort of, you know, shared conversations, shared beliefs, a sort of subtle change to what is acceptable in a sense. And I think, and actually it was Nick Chater was kind of talking about that earlier on today. I listened in, you know, sort of what is the what is the kind of what's considered to be acceptable in and so on. So I think it's sort of so I do think, you know, those sorts of things are useful, you know, but let's just not rely on them. Regulation, you know, one of the key things which actually changed smoking in this country was not smoking indoors. Regulation, you know, these are, it's not, I go back to this point, I suppose, you know, trying to sort of rebalance some of the conversation around this is not that necessarily, I would say, nudge is problematic. It is, but a reliance on some of those more narrower nudge sort of econ type thinking and approaches, solely reliant on that, I think you're in danger of missing out a bunch of other things in the process. So, but fair question, yeah, and hopefully I've answered that fairly.
Thank you very much. I think we managed to answer all the questions. Thank you very much for all those interesting insights, and we are very happy to have you here today with us.
Well, thank you very much for listening, and it sort of prompted me to really put my thoughts in order around it as well. So I thank you, and I appreciate your attention for the last hour. So, and thank you for the engaging questions and inviting me here.